Much of my career has been about seafood and about fishing. My dissertation was actually the management and regulation of the Michigan Great Lakes commercial fishery during the period of 60s and 70s, when on the one hand, as was mentioned at the talk last night, there was a period of consolidation, smaller operators being squeezed out of the fishery. I've also spent a good chunk of my career studying the fisheries of Lake Victoria in Eastern Africa, a situation that was characterized by an introduced species that then erupted, was a top predator, erupted, and significantly changed the structure of the fisheries, the ecological structure. But during the period of its dominance, its eruption and dominance, had tremendous economic effects, significant social effects, and as I mentioned in the paper, I probably won't mention this morning, was the source of foreign exchange for Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Because we were talking briefly about the cod. It's a firm-fleshed white fish, and so it's substituted for the cod. And that really drove part of the export demand. So what I wanted to do today was kind of reflect back on both areas where I've worked, as well as the bigger picture of fisheries, and pick up on the notion of the 100 years. How do we understand the 100 years of geopolitical, economic, environmental change? So, as we did last night, Radhika started with the imperial period, and I agree. That's really where one has to start. The European nations, and I know Japan is not part of Europe, but for the moment I'm throwing Japan in with Europe. Europe, Russia, and Japan, very active in finding sources of fisheries outside of their riparian waters. Indeed, both Scandinavian countries and England very active in harvesting cod, again, off of eastern North America, harvests of fish off the mid-Atlantic by Portuguese, especially Portuguese sailors, some Spanish. This leads to colonization, both economic colonization with trading relationships, but then also demographic colonization, settler colonies, and ultimately the administration of the colonies, managing the fisheries of the colony. This is driven partly by the experience, certainly in Europe, certainly in Western Europe and Japan, not quite so much in Russia, of an increasing imbalance between domestic seafood resources and population consumption. And that's why Scandinavia, Britain, Russia are here off the shores of North America harvesting. The limitation at that time was preservation. The main way they had of preserving was either salt solution in barrels, or sun drying, salting and then sun drying. This is where the bacalhau comes from. Now these trading relationships persist after independence, and especially in both Western and Eastern Africa. Okay. So the crisis period, the 30 years crisis, the supplies of seafood in the Western Hemisphere remained fairly secure. This is a period when there's a contestation between Russia and Japan in the North Pacific. After World War I, trade in the North and in the Mediterranean resumes, and trade between the North and the colonies. But then in the course of the 20s and the 30s, tariffs and quotas disrupt trade between countries within the North. The war reparations on the losing countries in World War I contribute, along with the capitalist dynamics, to the Great Depression, and that gets us into the crisis. This was a time, the crisis, the 30 years crisis, was a period of technological development, both in preservation, transportation technology. The name I like to focus on is Clarence Birdseye, who develops the flash freezing of food. These are both advertisements from United States magazines in the 30s. I believe they're from the 40s, so they're immediately post-war. But Birdseye was developing the technology during the 30s. It was initially developed to move meat from lamb from New Zealand to Europe. But very quickly it was realized, well, if you can do that, you can freeze fish, and so freezing plants were established. And then it was realized, well, if you can freeze fish on land, you can freeze fish on the water. And so you now get freezer boats on the water that eventually become the very large factory ships. Also developments in harvesting technology, and this is a theme that will kind of run throughout. The power of the boats increases and the strength of the nets increases. So with stronger nets, you can harvest more fish. Okay, after the 30 years crisis, the fisheries do come back, so to speak, rise from the ashes of the crisis. Technology, somewhat derivative of the developments, military developments during World War II, faster, more powerful ships. Now you start getting the movement of fresh fish by air, and especially from the sub-Saharan, but the northern half of sub-Saharan Africa. It's at that point it's a 12-hour flight into Amsterdam, into Brussels, and so you get flying fish, and developments of sonar. So now it's no longer, well, we think the fish are there. Well, that boat was getting a good catch the other day. No, now you can see the fish and target them. And particularly the mid-size, smaller to mid-size fish that school, obviously. It gets us to the bipolar period. Fisheries, this is really where fisheries management takes off. There's a little bit the residual there from the post-World War I period. That's when you get the formation of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. But the notion of managing a fishery for sustainable yield and then saying, well, yeah, but we want the fishery to make money. So how do we manage a fishery for maximum economic yield? And then the discussion comes, well, but fisheries are really involved with coastal communities, small coastal communities. How do we manage the fishery for social sustainability? And that's actually thinking that partly begins with several Russian scientists. Several Russian scientists and several English scientists are both involved in that, and then US scientists jump in and it kind of takes off. Again, technological development, and now the spreading of technology. This is where we get the beginning of the global expansion of technology, and European nations now are starting to rely heavily on African and Asian waters for their seafood, and the United States is starting to rely significantly on Latin American sources for its seafood. It gets us, as one instance, to the Peruvian anchoveta fishery that we'll hear about next. And so I will really totally leave that to you. This is also when you start getting regional fisheries management organizations that are regional. So the Eastern Atlantic Tuna Management Organization, the North Pacific Halibut Management Commission, that have various sorts of a range of authorities, a range of powers, a range of resources, but have continued to grow since then. You also start to get international environmental management organizations that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Okay. If you think about fish, okay. That kind of gets, a fish needs a bicycle like the fish needed the American decades, you know, right? American in United States, right? I mean United States. That's why the quotation marks. So dissolution of the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc, Western Europe attempts to have a common fisheries policy, but there's really no consensus on it. At that time, they've made some progress since. The nation state is actor. Well, what do countries want? Well, they want food, sustenance, basic food. They want employment. They want accumulation of profit. They want foreign exchange. And from all of those, nation states, governments want legitimacy. Now, picking up on some of the things that Radhika said last night, several of the speakers touched on last night, it's important to make a distinction between capital logic, the very structuralist approach. What does capitalism need to persist, to thrive, versus capitalist logic? What does a specific corporation, or perhaps even a specific set of corporations, narrowly defined set of corporations, need to accumulate wealth to increase in size and economic power? This is the period when neoliberalism becomes very powerful, at the same time that civil society becomes very powerful. And so we get ecological organizations, fair trade organizations, and if you put civil society efforts together with neoliberalism, you get market solutions. You get the Marine Stewardship Council. Essentially, picking up on the one speaker's thought last night, if you say to people, buy sustainably produced fish, how do people do that? Well, one way they do that is they look for the Marine Stewardship Council logo that's there toward the bottom left. It's a little small to see, but I wanted to keep this particular picture because, again, it's bird's eye. Bird's eye is still with us. 80 years later. Now, it's changed hands a few times, but bird's eye is still around, and now they're producing certified sustainably produced fish. Ecological concern, both for the target species, again, back to that sustainable harvest, sustainable yield notion, but also for the non-target species. How do we, but still with species, how do we preserve dolphins? How do we conserve turtles? How do we avoid charismatic megafauna from being harmed with our fisheries efforts? The American decades are when aquaculture really takes off, and you see that in this figure. The big blue band at the bottom is marine capture fishery. The orange band above it is marine aquaculture, and so you can really see about 75 is when it just starts to expand, and by 2009 it is accounting for approximately 20% of the total. The dark red band above it is inland aquaculture that includes both fish and seafood, and it has grown. The top band is inland capture, and you can see that it's very small. This figure ends in 2009. I was too lazy to go look for one that brings it up to 2014. But we are very close at the moment to having, half of fish harvest be aquaculture and half of fish harvest be wild capture. And the expectation is that aquaculture will continue to grow. We may be able to stabilize wild harvest. It may continue to decline a little bit. Some of the continuation of it is from fishing down the food chain, and there are strong arguments not to do that. Okay, so that gets us to the multipolar seafood system that again continued the dynamics I mentioned before of legitimation, accumulation, environmentalism, neoliberalism, globalization, and internationalism. We now have very growing geopolitical interests. China becomes a very powerful actor. Japan increases in activity. Iceland maintains a very strong presence, and in dialogue in relationship to Europe, the rest of Europe, Russia becomes increasingly significant as it regroups from the dissolution. Nations specialize in particular nodes in the fishery. Some build boats, some build gear, some register fishery boats. Most of the fishing boats are not registered in northern countries. They are registered in countries of the south. Processing goes on in various countries. Southern countries provide concessionary arrangements with northern countries so that their harvest boats can come in. Big concern at the moment is illegal, unlicensed, and unregistered fishing, and that has in fact provoked a certain amount of vigilantism by groups like Sea Shepherd. Increasingly, the fisheries, fish harvesting and fish processing is owned by financial firms rather than fisheries firms. The estimates are between 30 and 40%. Yeah, and enough that, and this gets back to the capitalism versus capitalists distinction. On the one hand, restaurants and large-scale food processors and low-cost grocery stores benefit from the IUU fishing. They really like the cheap fish. Both the conservation interests and the more upper-scale processing and food stores really want it to be controlled. And so at the moment, efforts are being made to control it. I think they will reach a point of diminishing returns. But what they are starting to do is to go after the countries that have licensed the boats that are doing the illegal fishing. Again, picking up on one of the comments last night, especially during this multipolar period, during the previous period and 2 decades in the multipolar period, you do get displacement of the small-scale fisheries and by the mid-scale fisheries, both national and international. And so that is increasingly an issue. Finally, a couple of very quick thoughts on the future. The dynamics will basically continue. As I said, there is now more a discourse about seafood sovereignty. There is more of a discourse, as I'll mention in a minute, about small-scale fishers. But fish are big consumption at the moment. If you think about the role of seafood, seafood is what either middle-class people get to eat that when they become middle class that they couldn't afford when they were lower income, and it's what upper-class people get to eat as a way of conspicuous consumption, manifesting their upper-class foodie status. This is part of the dynamic that's going on at the moment. Very significant labor abuses, both on the boats and in the factories. I'll pick on Thailand. Everybody else is picking on Thailand at the moment. That efforts are being made to control, efforts to ensure food safety, especially of aquaculture. I'll pick on China. A lot of use of antibiotics and preservatives that are not approved in the United States. Consolidation is going on at all stages of the value chain, even in the harvesting, and that's what's interesting. Conflicts, the geopolitical conflicts at the moment are more within the countries, between providing concessions, licensing to northern offshore harvester boats that then are taking the fish that otherwise would be taken by the small-scale national inshore fishers. That's provoked a global small-scale fishers movement. Actually, several different organizations, literatures. At the same time, harvesting technology is getting more powerful. If I had thought we would have a little more time, I would have put in the picture of the super trawler that in 10 days can harvest the entire amount of, I'm going to get the fish wrong. It's a particular, it's not, I don't think it's pollock, it's another fish. The entire amount of that fish that Australia licenses to be harvested. They can bring in this huge boat, just move it through the water for 10 days, process the fish on the boat, go somewhere else and scoop up something else. It may be pollock, I'm blacking on the name. Genetic engineering of aquaculture species. Species that reach desired market size in 1/3 the time. And so the powerful technology is going along with the globalization and the financialization. Fishing is to put it most bluntly, fishing is no longer risky. So, you invest in it. The kicker, as again was said last night, anthropogenic global climate change. Small increases in temperature make aquaculture, pick shrimp as an example, make shrimp aquaculture much less productive. You now have to control the temperature of the water, or you've got to breed warm-tolerant shrimp. And so I'm sure that there are laboratories somewhere biotechnologically producing warm-tolerant shrimp. That's it.
Can you just go to that link again? We just said the anthropogenic global climate change link. Wait,
I'm not
the link between them having to grow more.
So anthropogenic global climate change is making aquaculture less productive, because up until now, even if you do circulating aquaculture, you're bringing in water from either the river, the lake, the bay, that then is maintaining your pond at ambient temperature. As the ambient temperature goes up, your pond goes up. The other thing is that second important thing is that global climate change is moving the species of fish, and so we will pretty soon start harvesting in Alaska species that have been very distinctive to British Columbia. Sorry, you lost. And now, British Columbia will start harvesting the species that were distinctive of California.
And I address this mostly to Craig, but to both of you want to jump in, because some of your factual presentation kind of got me thinking about this too. One is, why did that fishery collapse? As a lay person, I don't know a lot about this, but I hear a lot of explanations. Overfishing, of course, mainly in the 60s, I understand it was like 800,000 or 900,000 metric tons taken off the Grand Banks when it peaked in the 60s and everybody was into it. Then there's the dragnet, destroying the bottom of the ocean. I don't know if there's ecological reasons why it collapsed, but everybody thought in the early 1990s it would come back pretty quick, and here we are 25 years later. Now you can go down and, put your sonar on there. We've done this, and take your 15 cod out pretty quick. It's no fun to it anymore like it used to be, but you can do it. Then last year, and I don't know if there's a connection between this, I was in Iceland for the first time, and I was really amazed at how back 25, 30 years ago, they dealt with your situation. And something really twigged me when you said they are having, for the size of their country, it seems to be a very disproportionate influence on European fish policy and that. And I don't know if there's a connection between the two, but and also these big, like the thing off Peru when the El Nino, the big shift there. I mean, that's astonishing. It's something you have no control over. So anyway, throw that out for your comment.
They have really worked to maintain their identity as a fishing nation. And so the national government is financially very, very supportive of the industry. That is a situation where the government, I think, is much more transparent about management and regulation that will not impose severe hardship on the fishery. I would amplify a couple of the things. There's one very interesting book by Trevor Kensington called Fishing for Truth. And what Kensington looks at is precisely that question of how do we understand the failure of Fisheries Canada to respond to the declining, all the indicators of declining cod in any sort of a conservationist way. And it is certainly the combination of things that both of you mentioned, the outmoded approach to management. There is, Kensington touches on this, other people have written more about it. There is a capitalist part of the story that the government scientists and decision makers were being encouraged to interpret the data in certain ways. And so, again, this is a story that is repeated over and over. Certainly in many of the U.S. fisheries, many of the European fisheries. Well, it's just a blip. Don't manage it as if it's a long-term trend. It's just a blip. Well, okay, by the third year, we'll cut back a little bit, but not really enough to make a change. And so it's very easy, metaphorically, to dig yourself into a hole in terms of fisheries management, because the population is now so low that it is going to take a long time to recover. And it's not going to be a normal short-term recovery cycle. It's going to be a long-term recovery cycle. And the question that U.S. fisheries are dealing with at the moment, fishery management councils are dealing with at the moment, is when do you get to really ramp up fishing? When not just resume, but do you ever get to go back to the level of harvest that you had before? Or do you have to be very precautionary as you're coming back up the growth curve until you're really, really sure, you've seen several years' data that, we're back up here in a stable way? And that's why we both mentioned and we both emphasized, I think, with anthropogenic global climate change, you're not going to see that. And in that sense, we are probably in a new era of fisheries management.
I wrote about the East Coast collapse, and I think it was strictly a case of capitalist greed. They just opened up the floodgates. Not only did nothing to limit or try to limit what European fishermen were doing outside of the 200-mile limit, but there was an intense capitalization of the Canadian industry starting in the early to mid-70s, because they saw the money that was being made, so they just joined the rush. And then it was good for 15 years, and then it collapsed. I think it was just, and it's no different than what we've seen, how the forests have been treated in this country, or what mining has done to the land of Alberta, the tar sands. I mean, look how far they're prepared to go. So I just think, no doubt there are issues around what was happening in the oceans themselves that were beginning to be felt, but I think those are probably pretty secondary. They might be larger today if such a scenario were being repeated, because the changes are starting to be felt in temperatures, acidity, and so forth. So I think it was, I was living there and I wrote about it at the time, not on an academic scale, but I thought it was just horrific what happened. And probably the most egregious of all is how they got away with it. This was the largest layoff, it's been called, in Canadian history. It's the equivalent of having about 5 GM factories in Ontario close overnight. 100,000 people lost their jobs, and dozens, if not hundreds, of these small communities dotted all around Newfoundland and to some extent Nova Scotia, Labrador, a little bit of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. A lot of those communities are actually gone now because this was it for them, although there had already been the process in Newfoundland of closing the outports. And so, I mean,
this is either, right?
Sorry?
They never really recovered.
Oh no!
It's
And so, I mean, there it sits, this experience, and really, I mean, Newfoundland doesn't vote Conservative anymore, and that's probably a big reason why. But the political fallout from all this was really pretty small.
Voted Green either.
Compared to what it should have been. This is a social disaster for Newfoundland, and it's recovered of a fashion. But what it says about, again, it's just another example of how this country, no different than the United States, treats its natural environment. I think it's a scandal. And then all this is being repeated on the West Coast now on a smaller scale, perhaps. Already now they can't. The larvae of oyster have to be raised on land first and then put in the ocean, because the oceans already off the coast of BC are too acidic to sustain the previous oyster raising. And with the warming winter temperatures now, we have no idea what the consequences for salmon will be. Already this year, there's serious damage being done to the salmon returns because the rivers are warmer they can't move upstream if the water temperature is, I think it's 20 or 22 degrees, and we're getting water temperatures at 24, 25 degrees because the winter precipitation doesn't fall as snow anymore. It falls as rain, and then it's gone. And so not only are the rivers not full of the springtime snowmelt, but they're a lot warmer too because they're not getting the snowmelt. They're just getting whatever is raining in the spring. And I don't follow closely, but the changes already in ocean currents off the west coast, and temperature, as you mentioned. I mean, the consequence, we don't have a clue really where this is going to end up. But the salmon fishery, which has already been seriously damaged by all the urbanization and industrialization of the rivers. I mean, this is the whole issue of anthropogenic climate change on the fore with the fisheries, and I don't think I don't think the population really is yet aware of really what's coming at us. I didn't know this whole story of Peru. This is fascinating for me. I have a colleague in Ottawa who researches, Peruvian social conditions and so forth. I'll be very interested in letting you know about your work and research. Is great, and I really appreciate yours. And the book, Trevor, you say Kensington?
Kensington, yes.
Okay, I'll have to find that. Yeah, thank you so much.
Fishing for Truth.
Yeah.
Can't forget the name.
I mean, one thing that, in both the presentations, there was that same graph which kind of shows the marine and the aquaculture thing. And from whatever you have, story you have built up in the case of Peru and Geopolitics, or the global story, the question, there is, of course, it's not only the question of the political power of the fishing barons, but also the question of demand in the global economy, which kind of drives that. And in a sense, the fact that it brings foreign exchange, it kind of generates the profits, is the source of the political power of the fishing barons also. There's some linkage. So in that context, then, we see that when the marine capture is going down, the overall fisheries output is still sustained by shifting to the aquaculture thing, in the sense that the global supplies are still kept growing in some way. So my question to both of you is, how do you look at the sustainability of the inland aquaculture or the aquaculture in general? What are the implications of that growth on resources, nutrients, water, inland water resources, etc. And what are the implications? Or is that sustainable?
It at the same time, of course, being an academic, I would say, well, that's complex. And like the first complexity is what does one mean by land-based aquaculture? And so in my paper, I go through a few examples. In East Africa, when I was working there, they were actually creating fish ponds on farms. That you dig the hole and you find the water source, and it's totally de novo.
Everywhere.
Now, when I was in Taiwan, I was there kind of for the tail end of the aquaculture boom there, and that was a situation where they were in coastal areas, but still just a little bit inland, and so these were de novo ponds, but they were able to access seawater for the ponds. Another problem with a lot of the aquaculture that is coastal is it's converted mangrove swamps. Well, if you convert the mangrove swamp, you've lost the ecosystem benefits that the swamp was providing in terms of protection from hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis, and the rampant shark. So you've diminished some of the ecological sustainability there, to the extent that you manage those ponds now more industrially. You're getting more organic refuse in the water, you're getting antibiotic residues in the water. And so if you now go the next step and put the net right offshore, the more Norwegian example that's repeated then in Chile, Chile and Argentina, because you've got the very high density of the fish, again, you've got a tremendous amount of refuse that goes down to the bottom, but then gradually moves around, and you've got the antibiotic residues and the other residues that you start polluting the water, and you've got escapes that now start genetically contaminating the native stock. And so the final point of comparison is the open ocean aquaculture. You take your net and you go out in the middle of the ocean. So again, you've dealt with much of the pollution problem. If it's a truly exotic species, you've maybe dealt with the genetic problem. That's where they want to start doing this genetically modified salmon. They'll take advantage of, in part, of the food that's available in the ocean, and they'll be able to argue we don't have any dangers of genetic contamination because there aren't anything like a salmon around here. And it'll be as I said, the tripling of productivity. So I think one has to very carefully analyze the problems with aquaculture. It's very difficult, I think, to say aquaculture cannot be sustainable. I think it has to be a somewhat case-by-case analysis. So it's complex.